my name is Tim Besley. I'm the current president of the Royal Economic Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on racial inequality. We're going to hear from our key speaker in a moment, Glenn Loury, and then we'll get a response from Lucinda Platt and from Zebedee Nartey. Glenn, who I'm delighted to say is joining us, I'm most grateful for him doing so, has been a friend of mine for almost 30 years, and we actually wrote a paper or two together at the beginning of that period. Glenn is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences. Although he's an economist by training, he really has ranged widely over the social sciences in the work that he's done, and is particularly a distinguished commentator on the issues that we're dealing with today. When I knew we were holding this webinar, I absolutely was certain he would be the best person to have us benefit from his insights on this topic, having thought about it for a very long time. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Glenn, who's going to give us some opening remarks before I then turn to Lucinda and Zebedee.
Thank you very much, Tim. I remember that paper fondly, that collaboration, indeed, 30 years ago. So I'm going to be speaking about racial inequality in the United States, and specifically about the disadvantaged position of African Americans within the larger American social and economic system. I won't pretend to expertise about the United Kingdom, but I think that some of the issues I touch upon will be relevant to the discourse going on in the UK. So thank you for this opportunity. In speaking about Black American disadvantage and its implications for American democracy, I will be drawing on my many years of study as economist and public intellectual. The argument to come rests on two conceptual observations, which I'll elaborate upon. One about the dynamics of human development, and the other about the foundations of racial identity. I will conclude by explaining my reservations about government pursuing a program to equalize racial group outcomes rather than simply aiming to secure equality of opportunity for all. Throughout this argument, I'll be guided by these normative principles: that persistent Black disadvantage into the 21st century is an American tragedy. That is, it is a national and not merely a communal disgrace. And that where inequality is a problem, it should be addressed forthrightly, but it should be addressed as a matter of human decency and not as a matter of racial equity. I hope to make the justification I have in mind for these maxims clearer in this presentation. So these principles, these two that I've just cited, may seem to be in conflict with each other, but in fact, they are complements. All right, let me begin with a provocative claim. I believe that the notion of structural racism or systemic racism, about which we hear so much these days, is an empty category. Anyone paying attention to the current discussions of racial inequality in the United States, in academia or in the press, will be familiar with these phrases. I claim that in effect, those invoking the phrase structural racism are bluffing. Their explanation of racial disparities explains nothing at all, and they are daring the listener to say so. Thus, a large number of Blacks are in prison in the United States, and this is said to be due to structural racism. Listeners are being dared to reply, no, there are too many Black criminals, and that's why so many are in prison. So structural racism talk is actually a rhetorical move. It's not a social scientific argument at all. It doesn't go into cause and effect. Rather, it asserts shadowy causes that are never fully specified or demonstrated. We're all simply supposed to know that any racial disparities must be due to something called structural racism, abetted by an environment of white privilege, supported by white supremacy, and so on. On this account, by this rhetoric, confronted with any racial disparity whatsoever, the response is that the cause is the system. Now, history, I think, is rather more complicated and more interesting than that. Many racial disparities have multiple interwoven, interacting causes, from culture to politics to economic incentives to historical accident to environmental influences, and yes, to the nefarious doings of individuals who may have been racist, as well as to systems of law and policy that may have the unintended consequence of disadvantaging a racial group. When advocates invoke structural racism, they beg questions of historical causation. They don't really make historical arguments at all. Rather, they evince a disposition. They call us to solidarity. They ask for our fealty. They demand our affirmation of a system of belief. This, I think, is a mischievous way of talking, especially in the university, although I do understand why it might work well on Twitter. Permit me then, in this brief lecture, to sketch an alternative account. I'm an academic economist, not a historian, not a sociologist. Nonetheless, I believe that to understand the historical fact of Black subordination in the United States and its implications for the future of American politics, it is more useful to examine informal social relations than to focus on formal economic transactions. To develop this theme, I wish to make two conceptual observations, one about the dynamics of human development, and the other about the behavioral foundations of racial identity. Why, I ask, the success of the US civil rights movement notwithstanding, has the subordinate status of African Americans persisted into the 21st century? Clear thinking about this intractable problem requires one to distinguish the role played by discrimination and bias against Blacks from the role of counterproductive patterns of behavior that can be found among some Blacks. This, I admit, puts what is a very sensitive issue rather starkly. Vocal advocates for racial equality refuse even to consider the possibility that problematic behavior could be an important factor contributing to the persisting disadvantaged status of African Americans. At the same time, observers on the right of American politics insist that anti-Black discrimination is no longer an important determinant of unequal social outcomes. I have tried to chart a middle course, acknowledging anti-Black biases that should be remedied, but insisting on the imperative of addressing and reversing the behavior patterns preventing some Blacks from seizing newly opened opportunities. These two positions can be recast as causal narratives. Under the bias narrative, one argues that racism and white supremacy are the culprits. Black folk cannot get ahead until they relent. Since on this view, discrimination is the cause of racial inequality, we must continue urging the reform of American society. Thus, of course, this, of course, is the central tenet of today's activism. Under the development narrative, by contrast, one emphasizes the need to consider how people come to acquire those skills and traits and habits and orientations and behavioral patterns and values that foster successful participation in American society. This is my preferred way of looking at the problem. If Black youngsters do not have the experiences, are not exposed to the influences, and do not benefit from the resources that foster and facilitate their human development, to that extent, they may fail to achieve their full potential. On this view, it is this lack of development that is the ultimate cause of stark racial disparities of income and wealth and education and family structure and criminal participation and violent behavior and much else. Of course, these two narratives, bias versus development, are not mutually exclusive. I recognize that. Moreover, they're not merely conflicting empirical accounts. They are profoundly different ways of looking at the world, and they carry with them profoundly different politics. What is clear, moreover, is that in terms of prescribing intervention and remedies, they point in very different directions. The bias narrative urges us to have a conversation about race. America must reform itself in response to demands to end racism. We must all join the crusade, the anti-racist crusade. We need more of this or that, whatever the this or the that may be on the social justice warriors' agenda. One hears this kind of rhetoric and reads these exhortations in the media every day. In contrast, the development narrative calls attention to the responsibilities of African Americans ourselves to act in ways that help realize our full human potential. It is not satisfied with wishful thinking, like if we could just double the budget for a social program, the homicide rate among young Black men would be less atrocious, or like if we can just get a local police department investigated by the US Department of Justice, then what? The development narrative asks. Then it'll be safe to walk on the south side of Chicago after midnight? As someone who has looked at the evidence, I find that an extremely dubious claim. So what are my two observations? A long time ago, over 4 decades, in my doctoral dissertation at MIT, I had the good fortune to coin the term social capital. I did so by way of contrasting that concept, social capital, with what economists routinely refer to as human capital. As you may know, human capital theory imports into the study of human inequality an intellectual framework that had been developed primarily to explain the investment decisions of firms, a framework that focuses on the analysis of formal economic transactions. In my thesis, I argued that this framework was inadequate to the problem of accounting for social inequality. Permit me to explain. My fundamental point was that human investments are essentially relational. Important things having to do with informal social relations are missed in the human capital approach. Human capital theory is incomplete when it comes to explaining racial disparities, I argued, and there are 2 central aspects to this incompleteness, and thus the 2 observations that I wish to make here about the dynamics of human development and about the nature of racial identity. First, I stress that all human development is socially situated and mediated. That is to say, I argued that the development of human beings occurs inside of social institutions. It takes place as between people by way of human interaction. Think about language acquisition, for example. The family, community, the school, the peer group. These cultural institutions of human association are where development is achieved. Resources essential to human development, the attention a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Such developmental resources, for the most part, are not commodities. They don't trade on markets. The development of human beings, largely, is not up for sale. Rather, structured connections between individuals create the context within which developmental resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. People are not machines. Their productivities, which is to say, the behavioral and cognitive capacities that bear on their social and economic functioning, these things are not merely the result of a mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities are the byproducts of social processes which are mediated by networks of human affiliation and connectivity. This was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities in America. And so that was my first point, the first point I wanted to make here. And the first point I wanted to make in that thesis all those years ago about the incompleteness of human capital theory. My second observation was that what we call race in America is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. the persistence across generations of racial differentiation between large groups of people in an open society where individuals live in close proximity to one another provides irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation within that society. Put directly, there would be no races in the steady state of any dynamic social system unless on a daily basis and in regard to their most intimate affairs, people paid assiduous attention to the boundaries that separate themselves from racially distinct others. That is to say, over time, race would cease to exist unless people acted in a manner so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this point. Race is not simply given in nature. It is socially produced. It's an equilibrium outcome. It's something that we are making. It is endogenous. It follows from these two observations that if the goal is to understand the roots of durable racial inequality, we will need to attend in some detail to the processes that cause race to persist as a fact in society, because such processes almost certainly will not be unrelated to the allocation of developmental resources in that society. The creation and reproduction of racial inequality as a social reality in any society, I conclude, rests on cultural conceptions about identity that are embraced by people in that society of all racial groups. These are the convictions people affirm about who they are and about the legitimacy and desirability of conducting intimate relations with racially distinct others. And here, I do not only mean sexual relations. My impulse to contrast human and social capital all those years ago was rooted in my conviction that beliefs of this kind ultimately determine the access people will come to enjoy to the informal resources required to develop their human potential. What I was calling social capital in that dissertation was, on this view, a critical prerequisite for creating what economists refer to as human capital. I think this point is crucial if we are to understand persistence of racial inequality in the United States. I wish to insist, however, that by invoking these social effects that limit individual achievement, in no way am I blaming the victim. Permit me to elaborate on this important point. Historically oppressed groups, time and again, have evolved notions of identity that cut against the grain of their society's mainstream. A culture can develop among them that inhibits talented youngsters from taking the actions needed to develop their talent. Now, given such a situation, I wish to ask, do kids in a racially segregated, dysfunctional peer group simply have the wrong utility functions? I think it is a mistake to attribute the dysfunctional behavior of some in a historically oppressed group of people to their simply having the wrong preferences, when those preferences have emerged from a set of historical experiences that reflect the larger society's social structures and activities. We wouldn't blame them for having those preferences, but it would also be foolhardy to ignore the fact that they have such preferences, if indeed they do. Another way of saying this is that when thinking about group disparities, social relations come before economic transactions. When ethnic communities and their local cultures are not integrated across boundaries of race in a society, then racial inequalities should be expected to persist. Such durable disparities deriving not mainly from racial discrimination in the marketplace, but rather from fundamentally more complex and morally ambiguous and difficult to regulate phenomena, embodying and reflecting what people in America, Blacks and whites alike, see as the meanings, giving significance to their lives, and most critically, from the structures of social connectivity to which those meanings will have given rise. People on the left of American politics who claim that white supremacy, implicit bias, or old-fashioned anti-Black racism are sufficient to account for Black disadvantage, as I have suggested, are daring us to disagree. Their implicit rebuke is that If one does not accept their account, then one must think something is intrinsically wrong with Black people. This is just a mistake. That is, they say, unless one ascribes Black disadvantage to bias, to racial unfairness, one must be a racist who thinks Blacks are intrinsically inferior. This is wrong. This is a bluff. It's a dare, as I have suggested. It's a rhetorical move. It's a debater's trick. At the end of the day, what these folks are saying when they declare, for example, that mass incarceration must be racism is that the high number of Blacks in jails, and I give this as only one example, self-evidently is a sign of racial antipathy. But as I have noted, one can also take it as a sign of pathological behavior by criminals who happen to be Black. In doing so, one risks being dismissed as a moral reprobate, and yet common sense and much evidence suggests that people on the whole are not being arrested, tried, and convicted and sentenced, at least not in the United States, because of the color of their skin. Jails are full of people who have broken the law, who have hurt others, who stole something, or who otherwise violated basic rules of civility. Prison in America is not a conspiracy to confine Black people. No serious person could really believe it, not really. Indeed, and self-evidently, the young gangbangers taking each other's lives on the streets of St. Louis, Baltimore, Chicago, and so on, exhibit pathologically violent behavior, plain and simple. Those bearing the cost of such behavior are mainly other Black people. And the ideology which ascribes that behavior to racism is transparently a bluff. Frankly, it's laughable. It cannot be taken seriously, not by serious people. Nobody believes it. Or consider educational test score data. Anti-racism activists are in effect daring you to say that some groups send their children to the elite universities in outsized numbers compared to other groups due to the fact that their academic preparation is magnitudes higher and finer and better, that they have more fully developed their human potential. And yet their excellence is an achievement. One is not born knowing these things. One acquires such knowledge through effort. Now, why have some youngsters acquired these skills and others have not? That's a very deep and important and interesting question of policy and politics and morality, one which I am quite prepared to entertain. But the simple retort, racism is not serious, as if such disparities have nothing to do with behavior, with cultural patterns, with what peer groups value, with what parents insist upon, with how people spend their time, with what they identify as being critical to their own self-respect. Who could believe that? Anyone who thinks so is a fool, I maintain. Asians are said here in the United States sardonically to be a model minority. Well, as a matter of fact, a pretty compelling case can be made that culture is critical to their success. Don't take my word for it. Read Jennifer Lee and Min Zhou's book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox. There, they interview Asian families in Southern California trying to find out how these kids get into Dartmouth and Columbia and Cornell and Princeton and Harvard in such high rates. And what they find is that these families do, in fact, exhibit cultural patterns, embrace values, adopt practices, engage in behaviors, and follow disciplines that orient them and their children so as to facilitate human development, which then manifests itself in terms of academic excellence. It defies common sense as well as the evidence to assert that they do not, or conversely, to assert that the paucity of African Americans here in the United States performing at the very top of the intellectual spectrum. I am speaking here about excellence and about the low relative numbers of Blacks who exhibit it, as if that has nothing to do with the behavior of Black people, that the outcome is due entirely to institutional forces. That, frankly, is absurd. Again, I maintain that nobody could really believe it. Neither does anyone believe that 70% of African-American children being born to a woman without a husband is either a good thing. No one thinks so. nor do they believe that it's due to anti-Black racism. They say it, but they don't believe it. They are bluffing. They're daring you to observe that the 21st century failures within African-American society, which inhibit our children taking full advantage of the opportunities that were created by the 20th century's revolution in civil rights, are palpable and damning. And yet these failures are being denied at every turn. This is not a tenable position, I maintain. The end of Jim Crow segregation in the United States and the advent of equal rights for Blacks through the last part of the 20th century was an absolute game changer. The fact that we are now a half century down the line from all of that, and we still have these disparities, is shameful. The plain fact of the matter is that a large part of the responsibility for this sorry state of affairs lies with the behaviors of Black people ourselves. I take no pleasure in saying so. I am simply trying to remain in touch with reality. Leftist critics tout the racial wealth gap. They act as if pointing to the absence of wealth in the African-American community is ipso facto an indictment of the system, even as Black, Caribbean, and African immigrants are starting businesses, penetrating the professions, presenting themselves at Ivy League institutions and outside numbers, and so forth. In doing so, they behave like other immigrant groups have done in America's past. Yes, they are immigrants, not natives. Immigration is positively selective. I acknowledge that. Still, something is dreadfully wrong when adverse patterns of behavior readily visible in the native-born Black American population go without being adequately discussed, to the point that anyone daring even to mention them risk being labeled a racist. It's all a bluff. It cannot be sustained indefinitely. We are, I believe, already beginning to see the collapse of this rhetorical house of cards. I want to conclude, given the limitations of our time. I want to draw from these observations a conclusion about durable racial inequality in the United States, and that is that it's ultimately a cultural phenomenon implicating not simply resource transfers, but more fundamentally, the decisions that people are making about with whom to associate and identify. These are identity conceptions that are embraced by people of all races. And as I have said, what I call social capital, when I introduced that term in my dissertation back in the 1970s, is a critical prerequisite for what economists routinely refer to as human capital. And I am looking to deficits of human capital as the fundamental source of disparities of economic and social outcomes when talking about persisting racial inequality. This human capital, the skills, the education, the work experience, the social aptitudes, the behavioral traits that reflect a person's human development, is in turn a powerful determinant of earnings and of the ability to generate and accumulate wealth. And if you want equality between racial groups, you ultimately must address yourself to these deficits of human capital acquisition, which are rooted to some substantial degree in the structure of intersocial relationships within the United States, which have a racial aspect. However, I also conclude that while we cannot ignore the behavioral root of racial disparity, we should, here in the United States, discuss and react to them as if we were talking about our own children, neighbors, and friends. My message to my fellow Americans is that we're all in this together. I want to de-emphasize racial identity and emphasize human identity in the context of a discussion about social policy to relieve these disparities. Persisting racial disparities deserve our attention, but not via racially preferential public policy. We should be emphasizing through law and policy that we all share a common citizenship and a common humanity. We should ultimately strive to get beyond race, although I realize that's a heavy, heavy lift. As Martin Luther King envisioned, our civic discourse should be grounded in an unwavering commitment to transracial humanism. That will sound like a pipe dream in today's racially supercharged environment. But given what I know about human development and racial identity, it would appear to be the only way forward. Indeed, there's a fatal contradiction at the heart of the argument from, I should say, for group equality of outcomes. We should not expect full equality between racial and ethnic groups in social and economic outcomes. Let me put that differently. Identity group-based egalitarianism is an incoherent social justice program. And dogged pursuit of equal results between racial groups across all venues of human endeavor is a formula for tyranny and more racism. Here's why, and I'll conclude. In an identity-focused view of the world, groups are supposed to be fundamental building blocks. Groups matter, their culture, their heritage, the music they listen to, the food they eat, the books they read, the stories they tell their children. These things are all said to be quite important, and they all vary across identifiable groups. On the other hand, group egalitarians claim that absent injustice, we would have equal representation of groups in every human enterprise, but how can that be? Because if groups matter, if their culture matters, if their identity is salient and significant, some people are going to say, bounce a basketball 100,000 times a month, and others are going to bounce the ball 10,000 times a month. If groups matter, their members will not do the same things. They won't believe the same things. They won't think the same things. They won't spend their time in the same way. Groups have their own integrity, expressing themselves and how they live their lives and raise their children, spend their time and so forth. This will inevitably result in a different presence across groups of a different presence of groups across various human activities. They will not have the similar occupational or professional profiles. They will not be present in the same proportion as members of the National Academy of Sciences, as tenured faculty members, as tech entrepreneurs, as hedge fund managers, as small shopkeepers, as single parents, as petty criminals, etc. I conclude that respecting groups' integrity while demanding group equality is simply a contradiction. Acting in a determined way on that contradiction can only lead to tyranny, disappointment, and more racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I should say to everyone, you can place questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom call, and we will have brief responses from Lucinda and then Zebedee. So over to you, Lucinda. Lucinda is a professor in the social policy department at the LSE.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to respond to this work. I've been using Glenn Loury's work in my teaching and reading it for many years. And I suppose I should also come to this discussion with the acknowledgement that I'm a sociologist. I'm also clearly a white woman, so the sort of personal aspects of this I necessarily come rather differently, and I am particularly interested in gendered ethnic inequalities, and I might say something a little bit more about that if I use my time wisely. And of course, I work largely on ethnic inequalities in the UK, which is a very different context to the US. And nevertheless, I think the political nature of the discussion, the competing narratives, as evidence, for example, by the recent report from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities and the responses to that report, and the challenges of reducing, for example, the very long-standing employment gaps, particularly among youth, may have something in common that mean that this is a relevant discussion from the UK and the US perspective, despite the fact that, of course, there are many other differences. So I would just say I recognise many themes that are sort of course, long-standing concerns in sociology. You know, how to properly conceive of both structure and agency, and to give them both weight without descending to the sort of over-deterministic nature of just stressing structural influences, or the individualism of just prioritising the agent. And I think also the challenge for sociologists of understanding what's going on in the family, and in particular how that sociologists have been very concerned about understanding how what goes in the family can be implicated in the patterns of social mobility or its absence, and in the intergenerational transmission of inequalities, and how to do this without, as it were, sort of blaming the parents, and what interventions in the family are appropriate and inappropriate. And of course, the relevance of social capital, the relevance of social capital in developing human capital, but also in terms of group interactions and the incidental nature, the incidental benefits of some forms of social interaction that was stressed, for example, by Coleman, that perhaps need to be thought about a little bit more when thinking about how to move this agenda forward. So, so to get to my comments or questions, really, I think it's really what I really value about this talk, and the paper version that I read beforehand, is the attempt to increase precision about how we understand these different questions, what is actually going on, how to explain it, and how to explain in a way that it is sort of rigorous and defensible. And how do you do that also without getting simply down a rabbit hole of sort of prior causes? Everything is determined by something that comes before, while recognizing the value of historical approach. So I think that's a challenge for all of us in this. But to get to more of the specifics, so Glenn, you talked about steering a sort of middle course, but clearly you were saying that you were setting the developmental narrative against the bias narrative. And I'm wondering whether it has to be an either or. Is it necessary fully to deny one while asserting the other? And I'm thinking here about, that there may nevertheless be gains to be had from people reflecting on their attitudes, on their actions. People like me thinking about what it is I actually do when I teach, or what my assumptions are when I research. Is that necessarily such a bad thing, even if it's not going to have a dramatic impact on inequalities, racial inequalities, economic inequalities, the other areas where I work. And clearly the implications for policy are different depending on the analysis of the problem, as you've highlighted, the investment in sort of institutions and development on the one hand, or stronger anti-discrimination activities on the other. But again, is it necessary to choose between one or the other? Is there scope for both? Is there scope for sort of having audits of the implications of particular policies or particular actions, or can gaps in fact be usefully highlighted because they beg the question? So if you see gaps in attainment, if you see gaps in employment, if a school finds that it's excluding more black pupils and white pupils, is it not relevant that they ask the question of why and think about the different ways that might have arisen, rather than just thinking that there's one answer to that? And also I was thinking about the role of organizations. So the long version, the paper version, seemed to be rather skeptical when talking about affirmative action or school exclusions, of organizations to be creative. But we know that schools can do things better or less well. We know that universities can teach better or less well. And it seems odd to think that all that has already happened by the time that school or university composition is determined. So if people have different levels of SAT scores, that then they're not going to learn. It's not possible to learn or to catch up or to develop at that point. It seems to assume that there's a point at which it's too late, that what's happened in the family, what's happened in the childhood can never be compensated for by what happens later on. And with my interest in education, I'd be questioning of that. Also, somebody works in a university, I think if it's all about composition, then we really shouldn't be here. I mean, maybe that is a conclusion we should come to, but it's not one I would take on very easily just now. So I was just thinking about this issue about social relations, and clearly, contact is very important. Contact is very important in how you perceive who is in your group and who isn't in your group. That becomes more malleable the more you have contact with others who are less like you, on whatever dimension that is. And so we also need to be able to think about how we create opportunities for such contact, while also recognizing that it may be unequal and may be unequally experienced. And so I think there's a lot of psychological work which shows that lower status groups may perceive more positively the benefits of contact than those who are from the higher status group, and may thus create further inequalities. So I think there's a lot of potential for social relations for equaling, but I think there's also the potential for them reinforcing in ways we haven't quite factored in group boundaries, even as people seem to be crossing them. So I'll leave it there. There's loads more I could ask and loads more want to say, but of course I have to let others have a turn. So thank you very much indeed. It's really stimulating.
Brilliant, thanks, Lucinda. So we're going to go over to Zebedee Nartey, who is a member of the Government Economic Service, and to give some reflections on these issues. So Zebedee, over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to have read the paper over the weekend and then to provide some comments. Mindful of time, I'll try to be very brief. Professor Loury's paper and his presentation was actually quite problematic for me over the weekend when I was reading it. It was challenging me in a number of different ways. We know that in the UK, there's large racial disparities. There's a recent report which was published a couple of months ago on that particular issue. And just used one example, which Professor Loury gave himself for the US situation, but let's try to translate it to the UK. Me as a black man, I'm more likely to be stopped. I'm more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, more likely to be denied bail, also more likely to be convicted and sentenced to prison relative to the population. And then while in prison, I'm more likely to receive less rehabilitation and therefore more likely to be back in custody, and also more likely to reoffend and more likely to die. And then my family is also then less likely to receive justice on that death. So with that as a background, you can understand why the bias narrative has taken stronghold in many people's thinking and analysis. But I also very much appreciate Professor Loury's approach in terms of the development narrative, where he talks about some of the behavioral observations in certain communities, how that may have consequences, inhibiting consequences on their human development and also the social capital, both human and social capital. And he references single parenthood and violence in communities in America, which also I think very much so apply to the UK. But I think his approach is a little problematic because there's an assumption there that the combination of discrimination and inherited inequalities plus bad behavior leads to, or poor problematic behavior leads to this black-white inequality for that particular differential. But I would say, although as humans, we have the agency to act independently and have free choice, we are very much linked into our past. As people of color, our history is already set. In terms of history, it is what it is. And the current discrimination is also what it is. So therefore, we inherit a cultural matrix which will shape and form our behaviors. So what I would propose is that the combination of both discrimination and inherited inequality leads to some problematic behavior, for sure. And these problematic behaviors can affect our cultural norms, our social norms, and also adapts over time. When you combine those three things in that transmission, discrimination, inherited inequality, changes, forms, shapes, evolves problematic behavior, which then causes that inequality. So I think more time needs to be spent looking at that, as well as the bias narrative, so to speak, the institutional racism or structural racism. I don't think, as both professors have said, I don't think it is one or the other. The reality is that it is both. How much weight you add to each, well, I think that is yet to be examined and needs to be examined even further. Professor Loury also spoke a little bit about, I should be very brief, 1 more minute, We also spoke a little about equity and equality. We know in the UK we can't sort of positively discriminate, but we can have positive action. Positive action to encourage and enable members of different groups, underrepresented groups, to overcome their disadvantage and to avoid discrimination. And that is to be encouraged. So what we're not saying is we want to recruit somebody, for example, because of their protected characteristic, their gender, their religion, or their color. But what we do want to say is where you have two individuals that are equally as good, but you have some underrepresentation in your particular organization, then you may take that into account. I said equally as good. We're not comparing apples and pears. We're comparing two apples and two pears. So I think that's really quite critical. And just as a closing remark from me, there's been very little actual work as economists on the study of race, from my perspective, from the little research I was able to do over the weekend. I came across one interesting paper by Advani et al. In 2021, which looked at the compositions of research in the top leading journals, and what share of that was by ethnic minority economists. And it's increasing over time, but actually it's quite small. But what we do find is that there's actually differences within the representation of those different ethnic groups. And those patterns are consistent, not just in economics, but across academia in general, and more so for very research-intensive universities. So what can we do as organizations, for example, within the government economic service, to sort of to go against that sort of grain, to increase opportunities for all, based on religion, gender, or your skin color? It's really to ensure that economics is one which touches many people at a very young age, so to really understand what economics is all about. It's not just about money, it's about a number of other things, social issues, policy issues as well. And that it needs to be taught in schools, not just, because what you find is those that often study economics at university is because the studies at A level, at advanced level, and therefore, and the schools that teach A-level economics tend to be those which are focused in on the private schools, and often quite male dominated as well. So what we can do within the government is to reach out to different schools to encourage the teaching of economics and to encourage people to choose it as a subject and therefore take it to university. And also to do work in the recruitment, retention, and progression of analysts and economists across the piece. So I'll end here to say that, Professor Loury, you gave me an interesting weekend reading your paper. It made me think hard and helped me to really assess where I was lying on in terms of the bias narrative, or whether on the development narrative. And I think it's a combination of the two. So I end here. Thank you.
Zebedee, thank you very much. So perhaps if Glenn and Lucinda could also put their cameras on, we can have a bit of a discussion. Glenn, I'm tempted to go back to you straight away and ask you, how does your analysis apply when you think about the economics profession? Are there insights from that framework for how Black economists are treated and developed, or do you think of that as being quite a separate set of issues?
Well, I suppose one could apply these ideas to the production of economists and the diversity of our ranks. I think that would be a rather obscure area of application given the stakes and so on, but let's think about it. So the word affirmative action and so on has been mentioned here. Economics departments are key, most of the ones that I'm familiar with, to increase the diversity in their ranks. There's a shortage on the supply side of very talented and promising young economists of color, Black economists. There are many, but not enough. If each department was determined to have one or two at all of the top 30 or 50 universities, they would be hard pressed, I think, to find the talent. There are two ways of responding to that situation. One is to lower the implicit bar and to accept people for appointments in universities whom you might otherwise not do. The other is to be patient and to focus on increasing the supply. You needn't choose between these two. You can do both to some degree. I think that I am inclined in my own preference and my own sort of political commitment to want to see the bar maintained and the supply increased. And I think that there are both reasons of practical consideration, but there are also principled reasons here. I worry that if one lowers the bar, let me give you an example. This is not economics. This is from legal education. The example is the Georgetown Law Center, a recent controversy because a professor was caught in an open mic, unaware that she was being recorded, reporting to a colleague that the students at the bottom of her first year law class were very disproportionately Black students, and she was worried about this. Now, the Georgetown Law Center practices affirmative action. They want to produce more lawyers. They admit based on the law school aptitude test, but they have a lower threshold for African Americans because there's a disparity in how people perform on the test. The test is correlated, not perfectly, but significantly with first-year performance in class. So the relatively low performance of African American students in that class could be predicted from the admissions criteria and the racial preference that's given there. Now, the institution might have responded by saying, okay, we want to have more African American students. We are using lower criteria in terms of test scores and grades for admitting, but we can remedy that situation by investing in bolstering their skills, summer program, intensive tutoring, whatever it might be. But instead, the institution responded to this revelation by, in effect, declaring itself to be guilty of systemic racism and denying the fact that there were racial differences in post-admissions performance amongst the students at all. I would hate to see editors urged to make decisions about manuscript acceptance in an economics profession. I'd hate to see tenure review committees making decisions about whom to award a lifetime appointment to in an economics profession, and so on. I would hate to see that being done on the basis of race in the face of discernibly different qualitative performance by people. So I'm willing to go slow, invest on the development side. If Blacks are 10% of a population, they don't have to be 10% of the professors of economics in every department. Trust in things working out over the fullness of time, as long as there are, as everybody is acting in good faith. But not necessarily expect that at the end of the day, I would have proportionality, which is what I was trying to say at the end of my remarks. I think groups are different in their interests and their orientations. There's no reason to expect that they're going to be equal in their expression of excellence in every area of human endeavor.
Thanks, Glenn. So we have a number of questions in the chat. One is, there's a well-known study. We know that equivalent CVs get substantially different response rates in job applications according to perceived ethnic background. How does your developmental approach explain this?
Oh, well, no, my developmental approach is not going to explain bias. and these kinds of resume studies, are certainly finding perceptual bias. I could answer like an economist. I want to look to the equilibrium. If indeed there is discrimination in the reading of resumes, what will that translate to in equilibrium in terms of wages for people? It might be more reflected in terms of longer job search durations for people whose resumes get less well regarded. But is there bias? Is there such a thing as implicit bias? Is there statistical discrimination? Yes, there is. It could be rational and still be very troublesome. Let me just explain that briefly. If I happen to know that the average level of performance in a population identifiable by race is lower than another population identifiable by race, and I have noisy information about an individual drawn from that population, the posterior assessment that I'm going to affix to the likelihood that the individual from a group that I know performs less well is an individual who performs less well will be greater because I'll use that prior information. Now, that's problematic, but it's also a cognitive, rational response to the limitations of information. If a police officer is encountering someone and knows only gender, age, sex, I should say, race, and how the person is dressed, that information is going to be used by the police officer in assessing the nature of the risk. And that could work to the disadvantage of a group from which a law-abiding individual is drawn, but whose members are more likely to be law-breaking. So these biases exist. I can't explain them with the development narrative, but I don't think that they're determinative of the larger social outcomes that I was calling attention to.
Thanks. And another question is, can you give some examples of the behaviors that inhibit human capital acquisition and how they might have emerged via the processes that you set out?
Well, let's talk about family formation and child rearing. The majority of Black children are raised by a single mother alone. I'm not making a moral statement in observing that 48 hours per day of adult supervision time is twice as many as 24 hours a day of adult supervision time, or that boys and girls are different, and through adolescence, a family context in which there are male and female mentors to affect the emotional development of boys and girls might be more effective than a household in which that's not the case. That's an empirical question, and it's a debatable question that sociologists engage in. But I could, along with my colleague of many years, the Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson, a friend of mine, I could argue, well, yes, we do see different patterns of household formation and child rearing and reproduction and so on. We do see different structural arrangements and family, but they are a historical product, and one should not at all be surprised that we would see different patterns by race in a context where people have been subjected to chattel slavery and the debilitating effects of that institution on social relations within families. So one could account for family structural differences by reference to history, and yet nevertheless think that those differences might matter for phenomena like the level of violence that we're seeing amongst young adolescent males in some quarters of Black society.
And Lucinda, how do you think about that issue, explaining, is there a distinctively different sociological approach that you would take?
Different from, oh, I'm sorry, you asked someone else, I'm sorry.
So
excuse me, Lucinda.
That's okay. So I think that, well, there were two points on that. I mean, one is that the emphasis on marriage. Is it marriage that matters, or is it cohabitation? And often the two merged in. I mean, the emphasis in the US is a lot on marriage, whereas in the rest of Europe, I think we talk about whether there's two parents around or not, and that may be cohabiting. It may even not be cohabiting now, and increasingly in some European contexts. So, but there's it's quite a big struggle to find that there are negative impacts of the absent parent on children's development in the analysis I've seen, which is surprising, but it seems to be there. So when you take income into account, particularly, so the loss of income matters, that goes with the father when the father goes, but over and above that, it's quite hard to detect effects in analysis, certainly for the UK, which of course raises lots of questions. But it also, I think, there's also the issue, and this is maybe where I can come in and just come back a bit. The discussion is a lot about the impact on boys, but I think we also want to know what the potential impact is. And your discussion was a lot about boys, whether there are negative impacts on girls on growing up with a lone mother. I mean, we need to care about the girls too, I think, and also the discussions about incarceration are mostly about men, and then just thinking about the comment about the economics profession. I mean, women in economics, I mean, there's a very, very big supply side there, is my understanding, but is it actually following through? So should we be so sanguine about the natural progression on the supply side, even if we get the development in place? So just wanted to add that in while I had the air.
Thanks, Lucinda. Sorry, I lost my connection briefly, but I obviously missed an interesting discussion. I'm going to ask a question now, which I think does challenge something you said, Glenn. It said, we do need to aim for equality of outcome for all races. This does involve supporting Black families to help children with their education. It also involves identifying and addressing racism, institutional and personal, in society. George Floyd was not murdered because he came from a single parent family. Barack Obama became president despite coming from a single parent family. So it's a statement a little bit more than a question, but I guess it's probably the kind of response you get quite often, Glenn, to your presentations.
Okay, let me respond sharply. I agree, George Floyd was not murdered because of his family background, but he also wasn't murdered because of his race. I defy you to demonstrate that George Floyd was murdered because of his race. That's a reading, that's a narrative that we've imposed upon a set of facts. The facts are that someone who happened to be a white police officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 43 seconds or whatever it was, to the point that George Floyd expired. That person was duly convicted of murder. We're the ones who decided to make a racial issue out of it. There are plenty of white George Floyds in the United States of America, which is to say, citizens killed by police officers who exceed their authority or use excessive force, and those citizens happen to be white. I would be very reluctant to racialize, it's too late now because it has been racialized, these incidents of bad police officers harming citizens who happen to be Black, because as I have said, if we get into the business of talking about crime and punishment and law in terms of race, we're going to have to acknowledge the outsized participation in violent criminal acts of people who happen to be Black, whatever historical reasons we might give for it. So I'll say that. I don't think the killing of George Floyd was a racial incident in and of itself. I think American society chose to narrate that incident as a racial incident for deep cultural, political, and historical reasons that we could go into. And I think the tendency to do that, there are some 1,200 police killings of citizens in the United States in a given year. Maybe 20 of them are unarmed Blacks killed by police officers under conditions like George Floyd. There are 8,000 Blacks killed by homicide in the country each year. I really don't want to talk about crime, punishment, and violence in racial terms. I'm forced to do so, but in doing so, I feel that we are inviting a kind of reaction which focuses on the race of perpetrators of violent crime, and that's not something we should welcome. Now, Barack Obama indeed was elected despite him having a single mother. I will simply note that neither Barack Obama's father or Barack Obama's father nor mother are Black Americans. I think Barack Obama's election speaks to the openness of the political process to people of color. We have vastly higher rates of participation in the governance structure of America by people of color, by Blacks here in the United States now than was the case 50 years ago. I realize that there are arguments about voter suppression. I don't ignore those arguments, but I just look at the number of people who are serving in elective office by race. We determine the outcome of presidential elections, as we, I think, did to a great degree in places like Georgia in the last election. So no, single parenthood is not fate, but I don't accept Lucinda's characterization of the literature about the relationship between family structure and social outcomes. I do accept her insistence that we think about girls as well as boys, and I apologize for my deficiencies in that regard.
Ben, there's a question which goes as follows. Social capital, in terms of what is valued, was this not set by a privileged group and assessed by the same privileged group? What about all the other skills and attributes not currently seen as adding social capital? And before you answer, you somewhat subliminally acknowledged your own pivotal role in origination of the term social capital. So I want to make sure it's not subliminal, that you were, as I understand it, the person who originated that term, and in spite of it often being attributed elsewhere. Anyway, what about the question?
Yeah, repeat the question, because I was so enamored of your last statement.
Yes, I should have said that first. Social capital, in terms of what is valued, was this not set by a privileged group and assessed by the same privileged group?
Well, punctuality. Who decides whether punctuality is important? I agree with you that that's a cultural expression. I can remember being in Italy for a seminar presentation that was supposed to start at 1 p.m. 1 p.m. came and went. 1:15 p.m. came and went. 1:30 p.m. came. I'm looking out, the audience is beginning to settle in. No doubt punctuality is a expression of what governing elites decide is important or not. They're going to decide whether they're upset or not when the meeting doesn't start on time. But so what? I mean, is it discrediting that a norm or a value might be affirmed or established or expected because of people who have privilege? Maybe their privilege is the fruit of their embrace and acceptance and adherence to the norm. I don't discredit norms like I want people to be at the meeting on time because they are espoused by people who happen to have done well in life. I think the questioner needs to, if he doesn't like that my economics department insists on a very high level of mathematical acuity before they allow you to sit for the first year instruction in econometrics. You can tell me that I'm privileged to be able to decide that mathematical statistics is a prerequisite for studying economics if you want to. I'm here to tell you that the fruit in terms of producing economic research is vastly extended by the fact that we insist on our students mastering mathematical statistics, and I'm privileged.
Thanks. So question here, what policies could reduce Black men's sense of despair at their possibilities, being subject to daily discrimination, not to mention probabilities of incarceration, etc.? And I might ask Zebedee to comment on that too in a moment.
Okay, and with apologies to Lucinda, I'm going to answer on behalf of Black men. I think vocational education is one area that desperately deserves greater attention. I think sending relatively poorly performing high school graduates or general educational degree equivalents into a community college with the idea that they'll transfer to a four-year institution and come away with a BA might be a good move for 1 in 10 of the population, but for a lot of people, they're going to struggle because they don't have the basic skills. But they can learn a trade, they can learn a craft, they can learn how to make themselves useful within the context of a vocational program. So that is one kind of thing that I would think about. The other kind of thing that I would think about in terms of broad area public policy is, and this is so controversial, expanding the choice available to households for educational service provision so that they can do an end run around the monopoly of public union, teacher union controlled big city school systems and let 1,000 flowers bloom through charter schools. I'm not talking about parochial and religious schools, but more competition in the provision of educational services. Those are two things I think of off the top of my head.
So Zebedee, do you have a reaction to that question too?
Yes, what I would suggest, we know that early years education is pivotal and critical to the growth and development of young people. So I think investing in that would definitely help. Family support in terms of, as Professor Loury has just in terms of the vocational training, to allow people to train in sectors and skills which are productive, which they can then find good jobs in. I think that's also key. But also, I think there is a which Professor Loury may be less likely to tend towards, maybe thinking about the education in terms of the UK, because that's what I know, in terms of the education of the Black man, in terms of how their understanding of what their history is and the confidence that they may have. So for example, what you find is, if you look at the data for school results at 16 and 18 years old, there's a big differentiation between Africans and Caribbean students, where maybe 20 percentage points different. And that's often because I think, I may be wrong, is that, for example, the African approaches, there's a culture by which you've been instructed to study hard. There's a culture known that not too long ago, if you were to go back home, life will be difficult for some people. So therefore, this is an opportunity. So I think because a lot of people have not had that relationship with their history, therefore, what they take as their cultural, the local subculture becomes their norm, and that norm is a new norm of now, but it's not a norm of those who were back home, who went back to Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, or whichever parts of the continent it is from. So I think having some idea of your history and that confidence gives you a boost. It gave me a boost anyway. I'm sure it probably gives others a boost as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm afraid we're reaching the limits of the time allocated. I think a couple of reflections on this. We are the Royal Economic Society and organising a joint seminar with the Government Economic Service, but I think we've shown the utility of not staying too narrowly within the realms of what would be called conventional economics, whatever that means these days, and having Lucinda join us from a sociological perspective has been a particular reminder of that. But it's been interesting how both Zebedee and Glenn in their remarks have embraced the need to at least stretch the boundaries of the way we think about these issues to have any chance of being able to address what are very, very central and important questions. And although there is obviously a different context from the debates as are playing out in the US and the UK, the broad analytical tools and frameworks are clearly quite common and have many features in common. I hope it's a dialogue, therefore, that we can keep open, because I think both sides have potentially opportunities to learn from each other. It's been a great privilege for us to have you here, Glenn, as being probably one of the world's, if not the most preeminent thinker in this space, and also to have some really interesting and insightful responses from both Zebedee and from Lucinda. So thank you to our speakers. Apologies to those whose questions I couldn't get to, but thank you for joining us. And this will be part of a program of events that we'll be running together with the Government Economic Service and the Royal Economic Society on a range of topics. I hope you've got as much out of this as I have, and I'll wish you a very good afternoon.
Thank you.